am live. I'm reading Many Lifetimes by Joan Marshall Grants and Dennis Kelsey. I'm here in chapter 9. This is their collaboration because they were both hypnotherapists, both in their own right, in different ways. And Joan wrote much about reincarnation and ethics, far memory. She's written 7 books. She passed away in 1989, and here she had just proven something which she had witnessed. Everybody thought she had a nightmare about this man who threw himself out of the window in the place they were staying, and then it was discovered that Leslie apologized the next morning after discovering from the manager that the previous occupant of our room had thrown himself from the window 5 days earlier. So what she saw actually happened. I continue. It was in June 1956, and I was married to Charles, when I encountered a suicide at the Abbey of Fontevraud, near Saumur, in the valley of the Loire. Fontevraud would have remained for me no more than a pleasant setting in which to walk off lunch if we had not come to a high, forbidding wall, where a notice beside a pair of enormous iron gates curtly ordered, "Sonnez le guide." On a sudden hunch I obeyed, to regret it a moment later when one of the doors opened to reveal a sinister man in the uniform of a prison warden. I attempted to retreat, which made him look even more surly, and I was still wondering how to convince him that I was not trying to smuggle a hacksaw to an incarcerated chum by the time he was locking and barring the doors behind us. We were now in a tunnel which, so thick where the outer walls, could easily have garaged a double-decker bus. "You will wait here until another warder comes to show you around," announced our gaoler. "Visitors are not allowed to circulate except under strict surveillance." The next thing I wanted to do was to see round the prison, and I said so. His eyes became even more glacial. "You must have wanted to see round the abbey. Otherwise, why did you ring the bell?" Before I could reply, he withdrew to his lair in the side of the tunnel, slammed the door, and stood staring malevolently through the barred window. A notice informed us that we were in the precincts of an abbey, founded at the end of the 11th century, in which for 700 years, until Napoleon returned it into a civil prison, a community of both monks and nuns was ruled over by an abbess. Ahead of us there was an open space of gravel flanked by high curved walls, and at the far side of it a steel door was set in an even higher wall. The only sign of life was 3 rose bushes, but they were not cheerful either, being smothered with greenfly, so we sat disconsolately on a plank bench in the shade of the tunnel, until after about a quarter of an hour Charles rapped on the door of the gaoler's lair and asked how much longer we were expected to wait. The door opened a couple of inches to vent. 20 minutes, perhaps longer, do not be impatient, and then slammed the door shut again before we could use the delay as an excuse to escape. I was far more uneasy than circumstances justified. I told myself that I was restless only because I was bored, but my feeling intensified until I had to admit that there was a ghost in the immediate vicinity. A ghost in a French prison seemed only too probable, and it was the last thing I wanted to see. In an attempt to tune it out, I did sums in my head, and then tried to remember the numbers of all the roads we had been on since Le Havre, but these evasions were ineffective. Reluctantly, I had to accept the fact that something or someone who 5 minutes ago had been outside my range of perception was relentlessly coming into focus. Now I could see 3 dead men lying on the gravel near the high hand wall. There was another man on the ground near them, But he was not dead, for he was trying to crawl. I could smell blood and crawlite and fear. The stench of fear was sickeningly strong. With an effort, I jerked myself back and said urgently, "Get out of here or I'll throw up." Charles was usually more than willing to help me dodge ghosts, but he said that he felt there was a job here which urgently needed doing. He already had a notebook open on the bench beside him, so I knew I must have been talking aloud instead of only seeing in silence. Trivial fears of making a scene in public, of being arrested as a dangerous lunatic by the warder, of returning to find myself being stared at by a crowd of giggling tourists, dwindled as I accepted someone else's much deeper fear, which I must try to do something about. I shut my eyes and started to see what had happened immediately before the men had been killed. But the scene was still impersonal, as though I were watching a colored film. I could hear myself talking, but it seemed unreal, as though it were being played back on a tape recorder. I can see 4 prisoners, French prisoners. One of them is quite young, the others are middle-aged, but none of them is the ghost. With them is a German guard, a boy of 19 with yellow hair and pale blue eyes. He is afraid of the prisoners, although he is armed with a machine pistol, and they have only wooden rakes. They are raking up straw and shavings which fell from the lorries which unload here. The Frenchmen are whispering to each other, loud whispers which they intend the German boy to overhear. They describe what will happen to Germans when the town is liberated. The boy tries to ignore them. He wants to shout at them to be silent, but he knows that to do so would betray his fear. He's becoming hysterical with fear. A muscle is twitching in his left eyebrow, but none of the Frenchmen realize they are driving him too far for their own safety. Suddenly he shrieks at them to be silent. They grin and go on raking the gravel. The gritty noise of their raking is the only sound. Then they start whispering again. The boy's voice is shrill with fear as he shouts an order at them. Suddenly one of the Frenchmen laughs. In panic fear, the boy lets off the gun. It jerks in his hand. I can feel it jerking. The gun has become part of him, as though the bullets spurting out of it were physical release from an unbearable tension. The body of the last man to fall is gaping open, as though it had been cleft with an axe instead of by bullets. The German boy is whimpering like a dog in pain. 3 of the prisoners are dead, but the youngest is trying to crawl away, dragging himself along on his elbows. Both his legs are broken. The boy turns the gun on him, but does not fire it. Perhaps there are no more bullets. The boy shot himself that night. He was to be court-martialed for exceeding his orders, but that was not why he had killed himself. He killed himself because he thought he was a coward who feared whispers. Pray for the soul of a German man, of a German who killed Frenchmen here. Pray for the soul of a German who killed Frenchmen here. Joan, come back, Joan. Charles' urgent voice brought me back with a jerk. I sat up and saw the warder unlocking the gates to let in a party of tourists. I think he killed himself on the 24th of July, 1944, I said dazedly. I'm quite certain of the rest, but not of the exact date, because you had to stop me. I nearly stopped you sooner, but you kept your voice down until the last sentence, which you repeated 3 times, very loud, and in French. The warder may have overheard. He probably had, for he stared at me until we were safely in charge of one of his colleagues, and I passed beyond the steel door which was locked behind us. We were herded into a Romanesque kitchen, which, had I been less abstracted, I would have noticed was similar to the one at Glastonbury. A tourist, bolder than the rest, withdrew a few yards to take a photograph and was sternly ordered back to our pseudo-chain gang. On our way to the refectory, we passed several barred gratings among the flagstones, where convicts now suffering as had rebellious monks in underground punishment cells. These, as a contemporary records, were damp lit only by a narrow window that was barred. The bed, a stone slab covered with mouldy straw, in which, on a diet of bread and water, they became so blanched and skeletal that they seemed like spectres rising from the tomb. Pray for the soul of a German kept echoing in my brain, and it did not cease its insistent beat until we came to the cloister, where, in spite of the neglect of the garden they enclose, a fugitive peace still lingers. I felt a lightening of spirit, a strong assurance that the prisoner had been set free of his ghost. Although I have never seen a ghost, though waiting expectantly in a place alleged to be haunted, I have met them under conditions which were socially awkward. For instance, the first time I went to Traleden to meet Charles' mother, he warned me not to mention anything remotely related to spooks, as at that time she considered that anyone who claimed second sight must be either untruthful or unbalanced. I was dressing for dinner when my bedroom door swung open slowly, due only to it having sagged on its hinges. Coming towards me down the long corridor was an old man, wearing a snuff-coloured waistcoat and leaning heavily on a malacca cane. As I had no clothes on, I pretended not to notice him, but he paused in the doorway looking at me very intently. Then he smiled and stumped off along the corridor to a room beyond mine. When I went in to dinner with Charles and his mother, I was mildly surprised that 3, not 4 places had been laid. I presumed that the old man preferred to dine alone in his upstairs study, and fretted on about such harmless topics as herbaceous borders and the prospects for the pheasant shooting. Then I began to wonder whether the old man was another of Charles' relatives, or only a visitor. So I steered the conversation towards him by mentioning his snuff-coloured waistcoat. I realized there was a sudden tension. So, thinking they were embarrassed because he was either senile or difficult with strangers, I tried to put them at ease by saying how friendly he had seemed and how much I looked forward to being introduced to him. There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Beatty said in a frigid voice, "I'm unlikely to be able to introduce you to my Uncle Arthur. He has been dead for 20 years. So I've finished this here at this chapter. There is at least one more chapter to come of this chapter 9, maybe 2. We shall see. Have a good Tuesday.